I love what you pointed out about Kirchner pointing that the economic science shift from the science of wealth to the science of human action. And in this view, I think we can realize that in a lot of the Austrian economics work, there is an implicit theory of learning. For example, when I read the work of Kirchner and when he explains the function of entrepreneur in economy, what I see there is a really deep insights in theory of knowledge and theory of learning. So my question is, how do you think we can apply these really deep insights on knowledge theory or learning theory that we can derive from Austrian economics to the actual teaching of economics?
I mean, it's a great question. We talked about it a little bit before, about how you can tap into that kind of decentralized process in the learning process itself. But here I'm actually going to point you to, your colleague Diego here, because Vernon Smith has probably done more than any current economist at getting at the contextual nature of our knowledge. Now that is Hayek's main research contribution, is the emphasis on this idea of the knowledge of time and place. And a really great paper could be written on the differences between the way Lucas views the nature of knowledge among economists and the agents in the economy, and the way Hayek views that same relationship, and then subtle differences and how that affects their economics. But things that I take Vernon to be emphasizing and what the lab does is allows us through its procedures of scientific control to isolate the context. In the natural world, the difficulty that we face is that we don't have the same kind of scientific control. So if we're doing field experiments that are not labs in the field, under a tent, but instead actual participant field experiments, we lose control. We gain something because, if I'm actually looking at the behavior and recording baseball card auctions, I get something out of that, but I do more when I put it under the control because I can isolate the factors, right? So Vernon's Nobel Prize address and then his book, Rationality in Economics, I really, really highly recommend for you to look at and for people to study here to get at this notion of contextual nature of our knowledge. It's a very deep understanding. There's also a psychologist at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin named Gerd Gigerenzer. And he wrote a book called Rationality for Mortals. And that also does that. Now that's more the scientific aspect of contextual knowledge. You're asking more about how you can tap in to the knowledge and unique circumstances of the students to make economics be more of a participatory experience for students. I think one of the really interesting ideas on this, and something we lost, is an idea that Robert Frank has, which he calls the Economic Naturalists. And one of the things he did for his students was he told them they had to go out into the world, and look at an economic practice. Let's say something like inventory on the shelves, right? And then come back and then write a paper relating that to the things that are in the textbook. So how is that a profit maximizing strategy? What are they doing? And then they learn how it is that people do economics. I think the more we get students to look out the window and frame it the right way, the more we can understand it. But again, this idea, Bert would know more about it than I would, but the best way I think is to a lot of experimentation, a lot of encouragement, a lot of self-ownership over learning.
You mentioned that some countries that respect property rights and do the quote-unquote right things are the ones that have prospered. Unfortunately, nowadays we have seen many so-called developed countries making probably some mistakes. Could you elaborate on how can you explain to a student nowadays countries that are developed that are following exactly the opposite path that you just mentioned?
You mean best practice turns out to be not such best practice? Yeah. So, that's a fantastic question. And I think that one of the things that we take for granted a little bit too much is because there's so much wealth in the West, let's say in Europe and in the United States, that we fail to see the pressure points that are in those countries. So one of the first things to remember is that Argentina at the turn of the century was the fourth richest country in the world. And by the 1930s, it was poor. How did that happen, right? And so these things can happen, all right? And so one of my favorite things that I keep pushing on students these days, this is going to sound boring, but it's not really, trust me. I keep pushing on them is to look at public expenditure figures and their basically historical trends. So the Economist magazine in 2011, in March, has a whole special issue on taming Leviathan. It's based on a book by Vito Tanzi, who was an economist, public finance economist at the IMF, I think. And it's called The Market versus the Government. And all he does is look at public expenditure data. And the level in which we're doing public expenditures in the United States and in Europe is unsustainable. Simply not possible. So what's going on in Spain? We have, Gabrielle here. What's going on in Spain is tough, but it's not all that different from what's going on in Illinois, or what's going on in Michigan, or California, right? Here's the difference. In the United States, none of the states have the ability to print their own money. So that puts pressure on our federal government to bail them out. Now, what happened in Europe? Well, what happened in Europe is because of the European Union, they no longer have the ability to monetize, which means they put pressure on. So you get Greece, you get what's going on in Spain, you get what's going on in Italy. So now, if this is the case and all these economies are suffering this problem and Adam Smith's juggling problem, right? And by the way, that's another thing. I mean, I will make one slight criticism of Milton Friedman, which is Milton Friedman so much convinced all of us that we had to fear deflation, that what we've done is we've biased monetary policy in the direction of inflation. So now you have economists, very smart economists, who will say things like, in order for us to fix the problems in Europe or fix the problems in the United States, maybe we should just have inflation of 6 to 10% for a decade. And they don't think anything about it. They don't realize the massive distortions that would take place in the relative prices due to that inflation. Nor do they realize that if people really are following money supply figures, let's say as some loose form of rational expectations model, how much randomness would have to be involved in the monetary policy to generate that level of inflation so that you can clear out the balance sheet, right? Which is what they want to do, right? What they want to do is they want to clear out the balance sheets. This argument is not viewed as crazy, right? Milton Friedman is a brilliant economist. He focused that aspect of that episode in the 1930s, and we became, as economists, because he's so brilliant, obsessed with the idea of debt deflation as this cause of everything. When actually, so I have a paper in a journal called Global Policy, which the only good thing about this is that it's in the same issue. It's an LSE journal. It's in the same issue with Joe Stiglitz, which is, that's my claim to fame. Anyway, but we call our paper in there the debt inflation, right, theory of the crisis. And what we're arguing is that when you have public debts, you then try to monetize them, you fuel the credit cycle problem. And that we need to worry about that issue of inflation. So, going back to your point, if Europe is in trouble and the United States is in trouble, then where do you look for the next entrepreneurial ventures? I don't know if Europe is going to be the source of our entrepreneurial future. And I also, sadly, don't believe the United States might not be the source of our entrepreneurial future. But maybe what we might see is, in fact, in Asia or something like that. That's Jim Rogers moved a decade ago out of the United States because he thought it was going to go to hell in a handbasket. Now, okay, so first of all, don't ever take my advice on any investment. Listen to you on investment, not me. I mean, you're successful. I'm a college professor. But as I always point out, I have taste for a Mercedes-Benz, but I drive a used Toyota. my professor, Jim Buchanan, always describes himself as he is a pessimist when he looks to the future, but he optimist whenever he looks backwards, because it never went as bad as he thought it was going to. And so maybe that might be our solution. And you got to remember is that as long as you get growth, if I was going to put up a board here, right, what I would draw is I'd violate all kinds of Austrian strictures here just to get for heuristics, right? That's how I describe these things when I draw models. I say these are heuristics. They're aids to help me think through things, and that's an excuse, one, for them to be incoherent, but yet help me think through their thoughts. But so if you think about a total factor productivity graph, right, and you can draw it like this, and what makes that total factors go up, wealth go up, is trade and technology. So I refer to that a lot of times as Smithian growth or Schumpeterian growth, okay? And then we have a third S that we have to include in the picture, and that's just government stupidity. So we have a horse race between three S's. Smith, Schumpeter, stupidity. As long as Smith and Schumpeter have their nose ahead of stupidity, tomorrow's trough, right, in the cycle, will be higher than today's peak. So you bet on the future. But there are times, and even though, so that's what Smith means when there's lots of ruin in a nation. Because there's lots of ways you can get around a lot of government stupidity. But when stupidity gets its head out in front, which I fear is what you're talking about is going on, like say, for example, since 2008, it's like, okay, let's do something to not fix the situation, right? So what we did was we turned a market correction into an economy-wide crisis by the very acts that we engaged in, right? And that's where stupidity gets ahead, and that's why you see downturns. But if what you can do is you can rein stupidity in just a little bit, right? The forces of Smithian growth and Schumpeterian innovation will keep going. Adam Smith has another line. He says that you can overcome, the power of self-interest is so great that it can overcome 100 impertinent regulations that human folly thrusts upon the market. Okay, I'm with Smith. People can get around a whole lot of stupidity. But there's got to be some point, right, where, okay, how about if it's 100,000 impertinent obstructions? I mean, all of a sudden you're not going to be able to survive, right? And that's what happens when great ideological movements sweep, the idea, right? And then what happens is that puts constraints on this ability to realize the gains from trade and the gains from innovation. One of the things that's a core idea that's in this, and one of the reasons why I think this university is so special, okay, is because one of the core ideas of mainline economics, in fact, perhaps the core idea, is social cooperation under division of labor. And if you read anything by Manuel Ayau, that was it. That's what he wanted to get across, right? When he was trying to solve the mystery of why it is that a person well endowed with human capital and great ambition is going to confront issues in their country and that thwarted opportunities, right? It's because the institutions don't allow the social cooperation under the division of labor to emerge. And so that's why the focus becomes on the system, right? We got to change the system and all that stuff. Well, that's really what Adam Smith taught. It's what J.B. Say taught. It's what, Ludwig von Mises taught. Right? And so it's that idea of what it means to be an economist that I'm trying to capture here. There's a great line on this thing, which I love, by the way. I'm a collector of all memorabilia about me. But it's a great line in here. It says, to teach and disseminate the ethical, legal, and economic principles of a society of free and responsible persons. Bingo. Right? That is at the core, the essence of what mainline economics is trying to do. And that's one of the reasons why this is such an honor for me to stand up here and focus on that.
Thinking about this timeline, I think the most important debates were sort of like the debate on method first, then the calculation debate. So it seems like all the time, at least during the last century, we've been trying to speak from a sort of mainline position towards a mainstream position. but we haven't been much successful in becoming a mainstream, in the sense that Austrian economics is not as well known as perhaps other methods of mathematics and that kind of modeling. So don't you think it would be a little more productive, so to speak, to, instead of trying to bring philosophy into economics, trying to do the same, the other way around, like trying to bring economics into other areas of study, like philosophy, ethics, and not just that, but also probably psychology, education majors, and that kind of things.
Yeah.
I'm not implying that it hasn't been done, but probably put more emphasis on that.
No, one of the main messages of my book what the book does, it's divided up into 3 different sections, right? One of them is on the teaching of economics, what I think students should be taught. The second one is master teachers of economics. That is examples of people who teach the core principles of economics and in their writings and that. And then the third section is how I think you should do economics if you follow that advice. But in that second section, which is the largest section of the book, it's biographical essays about various different economists and the way and aspects of their work which relate to this mainline economics. And in that, what I want to stress, which relates to your question, is in post-1950 economics. So think about it this way. The narrative that I want to tell is that economics in 1949 had a pivotal moment. It could go in the direction of Mises, or it could go in the direction of Samuelson. Samuelson, the dates are a little off, right? Because Samuelson publishes Foundations of Economics in 1947. He publishes Economics, his textbook, in 1949, I think. So what you have is or vice versa. Might be vice, I don't know, but it's like that, it's 48, 49, something like that. And what happens is Samuelson is the direction that most economists go in, and he controls both principles market and graduate market. It's a brilliant move on his part, because what he did, he's a very, very bright man. And as he said, I don't want to write the nation's laws as long as I get to teach its economics. And he did. He taught its economics. And the pinnacle of Samuelsonian economics is what's called institutionally antiseptic theory. That's a phrase that his whole group used when they were describing their pure theories in the mid-50s, early 60s. And you get the neo-Keynesian synthesis, and you have it as if benevolent despots are running things, and blah, 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 and all this stuff, okay? And that's how economics went on. So think about all of the very cool developments in economics starting from 1950 forward that's on this graph. And every single one of them is an example of what you're talking about. Ronald Coase conquers law. Okay? Armin Alchian, property rights. That leads to economic history, right? Because that's what Doug North is a derivative of. All right? Business is captured by Armin Alchian and the idea of a property rights theory of the firm, which is a follow-up on Coase, which then leads to Williamson. Okay? You could think about Jim Buchanan and politics. All right? You can think about Vernon Smith and the application of economics to experimental methods. Every single one of the examples that I would give of progress in economics post-1950 are, in fact, doing exactly what you talked about intellectually. And that's because we're trying to recapture what the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers already knew, which is that there is no such thing as economics. There's only social science applied to economic problems. And we have a unified theory of the social sciences that then is applicable to all these different walks of life. And so the book is written to make that message very clear. So if economics is done correctly in the end, we're much more humble, but yet at the same time, we're intellectually arrogant in the sense that economics is the one true science, right? In the social sciences, okay? But we're also extremely humble in the sense that we can't design right? The outcomes. We can't use that knowledge for control. So I just did a paper on Henry Hazlitt, which utilized a lot of the materials here. In fact, tremendous amount. Fantastic resource that you have here. And Henry Hazlitt's just an amazing, I recommend all of you to spend some time getting to know his full biography, because he's just phenomenal. And Hazlitt came across economics for a very simple reason. He was working at the Wall Street Journal, very young man. He had to quit college when he was 17. All right, so he was at City College, and a lot of its personal reasons has to do with his mom actually got a second divorce, and a scandalous divorce. And at that time, culturally, it was unfit for his mother to go to work. So Henry Hazlitt had to go to work to help support his mother. So he gave up his dreams of being a professor of philosophy, which is what he wanted to be. By the way, Gabrielle is a wonder kid, so he'll appreciate this. Hazlitt published his first book at the age of 19 with Dutton, which is a really good press, okay? And it's called Thinking as a Science. And he was afraid when he got the acceptance to go into Dutton, because he said, I'm so young, they might not give me the contract, you know. So, but anyway, so Hazlitt's a really special guy. He gets this job at the Wall Street Journal because it pays more. And he has to support his mom, not because he cares about economics or anything. He goes there. And, well, he does care about economics because he read Herbert Spencer when he was a kid. So he was a Spencerite, you know. But anyway, he goes there and he gets given an assignment. And on his first assignment, he writes up a report. One of his buddies at the thing says, do you even know what you're talking about? Because he had written about dividends, but he got it all wrong. But no one caught him on it. So he thought to himself, God, this is a really good paying job. If I screw this up, I'm going to lose a good paying job. So I better know what the hell I'm talking about. So he goes to the library, Flatbush, New York Public Library in Flatbush, and he wants to pick out a book to read in economics. Now just think about the fatefulness of this choice. He picks up Wicksteed's Common Sense of Political Economy. Imagine if he picked up any other book, but he picks up Wicksteed's Common Sense of Political Economy, and that then frames him, his whole life, it's about Wicksteed and Mises. That's, you know, Wicksteed and Mises, that's all the way from his economics, all the way up through his ethics theory. If you go and read the Foundations of Morality, it's his understanding of Wicksteed and Mises' theory of social cooperation applied to questions of morality, right? So, just that fateful choice. And what I in this paper, I point out is during Hazlitt's lifetime, we moved from a period where the title of a very popular book in economics was called The Common Sense of Political Economy, to a world where a common textbook was called The Economics of Control. There is no economics of control in the main line of economics. Economics is not a science of control, it's a science of understanding. And that difference is a huge difference in the way we think about all that stuff. So, long-winded answer. Any other questions?
Yeah, Pete, could you just elaborate a little bit more about what you meant by you can't be an economist by just studying economics, what those other foundations are, or what that context is? And also speak about a little bit about Kenneth Boulding. Yeah. You and I were both in the same class of Boulding back in '85. And that was certainly someone who was more than an economist.
Yeah. All right, so the first thing, let me take the first question first. So what do I mean by an economist? Economics and the science of economic life is always embedded within a variety of other things. A system of morality, a system of law, a system of how we understand the relationship between the citizen and the state. Part of the argument in the book is based on a series of papers that I've written on the changing nature of the state and the changing nature of what it means to be an economist. And if you think about it in a simple way, imagine a 2x2 matrix, and on the columns we have the state, and we can view the state as a referee or the state as an active player in the economic game. And then the rows would recommend the economist as a student of society or the economist as a savior of society. okay? And what I argue in these various different papers that there's only two stable equilibria. The stable equilibrium of the economist as student and the state as a referee, or the state as a active player in the economic game, and then the economist must be the savior in the thing, right? And the argument is that the one equilibrium doesn't generate good results, right? And the other one does, right? And so, but this is the trying to explain the sociology of the profession and the shifting. So we always exist. So to give you an example, just, and get out of this question quickly, there's a wonderful book by Daniel Dennett called Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And in the book, what Dennett points out is that there is no such thing as philosophy-free science. All science has philosophical presuppositions that they bring to bear. So you can't act as if. So the choice is not no philosophy and science. It's between articulated and defended philosophical positions and inarticulate and non-defended positions. And we would prefer to have articulate and defended positions. So I think that's also true of economics. There's an implicit legal theory that people have. There's an implicit politics that they have. There's an implicit philosophical position that they have. And we want to make it explicit. One of the, in my opinion, the biggest implicit thing that economists have is an implicit historical narrative. I call that historical narrative Mrs. Jones' theory of history, because it was in 8th grade when they were introduced to history by Mrs. Jones, and she told them that there was these robber barons that, squashed the, throats of the, downtrodden in the United States, and that we needed antitrust policy, and we needed all these other things like that, and this is their implicit understanding of what goes on. Even really good economists still have this view in the back of their head. So the first thing we need to do is disabuse them of that. And in order to do that, you can't do that just by straight economics. You got to actually talk history. You can actually read a history book. Like, here, let's look at this. Why don't you read some history? Like that. And so that's important. I do think, by the way, that, okay, so the metaphor I use all the time. You got to remember, I went to Grove City College. Grove City is not that much different from UFM, except a little bit more traditionalist when it comes to religious views. So I was exposed a lot to a doctrine called Christian presuppositionalism as a student. It permeated a lot of what we were taught. And they taught us this method about the idea of your rose-colored glasses. It's a Polanyi S point, too. Actually, as a freshman, we had to read Science, Faith, and Society by Polanyi. I've always thought that that's what economics is like. The world right now without my glasses on is a buzz. I can't really see people here. I see that some people are deciding to leave because I've been talking too long. But I'll just continue talking. Once you put the glasses on, now all of a sudden it comes into sharp relief. So economics, I think, provides us that, which is different from a lot of other things. And so I think it has a certain core idea, but you can't do economics without doing the other stuff. Your second question was Boulding. All right, read the chapter in the book. It's awesome. Kenneth Boulding was a fantastic professor. Bert and I were lucky to have him. He was in his 80s when we had him. He used to have me over to his apartment to have milk and cookies, literally. Right? You're young in your 20s, you want to have a beer. He'd be like, here's some milk and cookies, young man. He did watercolors. He did watercolor paintings, which my son Matthew excelled beyond when he was 5. And Matthew wasn't the best painter. But Kenneth Boulding would look at these watercolor paintings, which would hang on his refrigerator, and he would say, "Isn't Fairfax beautiful?" If you've ever been to Fairfax, you would not describe it as beautiful. It's like suburbia. But Kenneth Boulding is a fantastic man. He and his wife had 8 kids, I think, and 22 different grandchildren, and they're both academics. And we used to say to him, Mr. Boulding. He never wanted to be called Professor Boulding because he's from the old school, so they just called him Mr. Boulding. He says, "Mr. Boulding, do you miss your wife Elsie?" He says, he's 80, remember. He says, "Oh no, we have our rendezvous," like that. He says, "We meet at the conferences, we have our romance there, and then we go back, to our academic work." He was just a wonderful human being, thought economics. He won the John Bates Clark Award as a young technical economist, and then he turned his back on technical economics and embraced economics as a moral science. And my next to next book, I'll end with this. My next to next book. So my next book is a very policy-oriented book. It's called, well, again, this is a title we're having problems with, but it's basically Against Emergency Room Economics, similar to the question you asked. But my book after that is going to be on the fate of moral philosophers in the age of economic scientism. And it's a case study of the careers of Kenneth Boulding, Albert Hirschman, and Amartya Sen. And it's bookended by Hayek and Buchanan. And so I'm looking forward to getting to that, but not till after I thoroughly attack what we've been doing over the last 4 years throughout the world for taking simple market corrections and turning them into a global economic crisis, which I think people need to be held responsible for. But anyway, thank you very much. Appreciate it.